I'm Bess Rocklitzer, president of the David Berman Foundation. Welcome to Color Light Motion, created and hosted by Victoria Vesna. Today we bring you Dr. Cristina Albu. Cristina is an art historian, an educator, and a writer who focuses on the crossover between art, science, and technology. She is Associate Professor of Contemporary Art History at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and she is the author of a book titled The Mirror Effect, as well as a new book titled Body-Mind Signals. Please enjoy Cristina's presentation. Thank you so much, Cristina, for joining us.
Thank you, Bess, and welcome everybody to this 13th episode. I'm particularly excited about this episode with Cristina Albu, who I've had the pleasure to interact with for the last couple of years with her interest in cognitive science and technology and looking at perception, which I think is so important for all of us, and thinking about shared spaces. And currently she's working on a new book with neurofeedback. James Seawright was one of David's favorite artists. There's many of his works that are in the collection now in the Butler Museum and also in his residence. And we're coming to you from a number of different time zones. I'm logging in from Venice, Italy. Ellen Levy is joining us, and she's a wonderful curator, artist, friend, also very much working with neuroscience. And recently she co-edited a fantastic book with Charissa Terranova, Darcy Thompson's Generative Influences in Art and Design. And after the book, she went ahead and did a fantastic exhibition on From Forces to Forms that was at the Pratt Institute of Art. I had also the pleasure to be part of it, but just wonderful to have you, Ellen, join as a responder. And in the fall, we're actually going to hear Ellen talk about her work in relation to the collection. And finally, a new person I haven't met yet, so I have a pleasure to meet, is Neen Humphrey, sorry. She also works with neuroscience, neurobiology of emotion, and she's a longtime resident in New York's Ledoux Lab, working with neuroscientists. So today, we will have David Famillion also join us, who's become a real friend of the David Berman Foundation, and James Jimjewski also is joining us, nanoscientist. We have a beautiful group of people, and I'm so happy to introduce Cristina once again. Cristina, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for
recording in progress.
And today I'm going to talk about phenomenal art in David Berman's collection, and I'm going to go over a bit of an introduction to that term as well and how it's being used in this particular presentation and in James Seawright's theory about it. So the title of my presentation is Floating Reflections, and I'll be addressing a series of artworks by James Seawright, Getulio Alviani, and Julio Leparc, which are part of the Berman collection. And all these works have reflective properties and invite the public to consider the mutability of the physical world. They also highlight the web of relations between perception, environment, and viewers, decentering the subjective look. They mirror back a fractured and unstable world whose image perpetually fluctuates in relation to the viewer's vantage point, physical laws, and environmental variables. So this is a bit of a bracket to give you a bit of an overview about the use of the term phenomenal art, which is generally applied to artworks which belong to the licensed space art tendency, which originated in California in the 1960s and 1970s, and artists that are affiliated with it, such as Zach Wheeler, James Turrell, and Robert Irwin, use light and space as media in their practices. And a number of these artists were closely familiar with phenomenological philosophy, especially Robert Irwin drew extensively on the writings of Edmund Husserl in his own inquiries into perception. The term phenomenal art is more rarely brought into conversation when we talk about kinetic art, which has often been marginalized in genealogies of art from the 60s and 70s, and I think it's gaining a much more prominent role at present. But it's also kind of marginalized when we talk about the relationship between art and theory, because many of these works are usually associated with this kind of mindless playfulness. But I think there's a lot of depth to that play that is triggered by some of these kinetic artworks. So for instance, Group Zero, Nouvelle Tendance, and Group de Recherche d'Art Visuel artists were equally interested in the variability of light phenomena while considering the contingency of perception. But many of these artists motivated their interest based on the exploration of objectivity rather than subjectivity, and the desire to render both art production and art reception more democratic in character. They had this kind of anti-elitist stance in developing their practices. The term phenomenal art has been extensively used by American artist James Seawright in relation to his own practice. And he has his own understanding of this term, which I'm going to go over right now. And James Seawright is primarily known for the design of cybernetic sculptures in the 1960s, which self-regulate their behavior and respond to changes in their environment. And in the top right corner of the slide, you can see a view of his work, Scanner, which is based on photocells. And it's a work that projects light from its center towards the ceiling, and also reflects this light through a system of mirrors all across the room. And the sculpture also has this moving arm, I think you can barely see it over there, which hangs down from this wire ball, and it swings in various directions, responding to changes in the degrees of illumination in the room. So James Seawright defines phenomenal art in separation from phenomenology, using the term to describe what he calls structures of objects that undergo changes of their own that are inherent in them, that they are built to physically change. And he says that this phenomena might be changes of illumination, or changes of spatial relationship, or sound production. And he also adds that his own work produces phenomena, and that he's really interested in exploring the form and structure of this phenomena, the way they are organized. So this is his statement from 1969 when he gave the Guggenheim lecture. And as you can note, based on the entirety of it, the focus of James Seawright is on the relationship between the object and the environment rather than the subject of perception. And he points out that changes in terms of the cybernetic sculptures very often take place even in the absence of a human observer. He says he wants to eliminate from consideration works that produce phenomena, which are the result of some change in the relationship between the work and the viewer. So here we see this kind of key difference between phenomenal art associated with light and space art versus his own practice. So Seawright is intent on dislodging a human-centered perspective upon changes and offering a much broader perspective on the agency of objects, machines, and the environment. So this was my slightly long parenthesis on his use of the term phenomenal art. So let me tell you a little bit more about James Seawright, who was born in 1936 in Jackson, Mississippi, and he passed away earlier this year. Seawright had a great grasp of the technological apparatuses that he was using, and he loved tinkering with electronics. He learned a lot about them just by observing others, tinkering with them too. And he often compared the creation of his works with the design, the construction of musical compositions. He studied at the University of Mississippi, where he majored in English and minored in physics. And some of the knowledge of electronics, he also acquired it in the Navy. He was part of a program during his youth. In 1968, he moved to New York City and studied at the Art Students League. He also offered a course on visual perception at the Institute of Visual Studies in New York. And for a very extended prolific period of time, he was the director of the visual arts at Princeton University. His practice is primarily associated with computer-based sculptures, but he also created props and light programs for dance performances, especially in collaboration with his partner, Mimi Garrard. He also designed mirror works. I'm going to talk a lot more about them today. And video works, which are focused on the morphing of abstract shapes. And he called the latter ones virtual sculptures. And on the right, you can see one of his prints that is actually based on images from these videos. Seawright always privileged the process of creating his works over the object, and he invited the sort of intuitive relationship between viewers and cybernetic sculptures. He loved, the way people would investigate and test out various possibilities in terms of the correlations that might exist between the environment and the cybernetic systems that he devised. In this slide, you can also see him pictured together with David Berman. You can see their reflections encompassed in this image of Seawright's work, the double mirror. And as Victoria was mentioning earlier, they had a really long relationship. And Seawright greatly appreciated Berman's foresight in terms of the collection of technological art that was reflective of this kind of changes in conceptions about notions of space and time throughout the 20th century. And he also stated that he loved that Berman pushed artists in directions they didn't necessarily want to go into. And I think that as we look at the exchanges, the letters that Berman sent to artists when commissioning works, we often see specific requirements about the scale, the colors of light, and also the reliability of the works they would design, especially if they were supposed to be displayed in the open air. Seawright's works were featured in the Pulse exhibition, focused on the David Berman collection. And Pulse is an acronym for People Using Light, Sounds, and Energy. And the first major New York-based exhibition of the Berman collection took place in 1987. And the exhibition was curated by Tom Finkelpearl, who, just as David Berman, has been a great supporter of public art. And he would say that the main connections between the works that were exhibited in Pulse was the variable qualities of them. He was less interested in, the commonalities in terms of the use of the light medium, and more interested in this kind of variability of the works, their phenomenal quality, according to Seawright. A second large-scale exhibition of Pulse took place in 1990 at the University Museum of Santa Barbara. And this was much wider in scope, pairing works in the collection that were optical, kinetic, with works that were site responsive, and also minimalist works such as those of Dan Flavin, and light and space works like those of Robert Irwin. And as the curator of the exhibition, Phyllis Plus said, exhibition visitors often turned into performers in relation to the object. And the works of Seawright, as I was mentioning, more specifically, his robotic plants were featured in both exhibitions. In this slide, you can see a range of his projects. So on the left, you can see Searcher from 1966. And you can see this cybernetic sculpture kind of has anthropomorphic qualities to it. The aesthetics of the machine are clearly visible. And Seawright was really keen on demystifying technology and making it more approachable so that people could kind of explore the components of the work. They would always be made perfectly visible. And this work, just as Scanner, the other one I was mentioning, response to light by either avoiding it or by actually moving towards the light, depending on the state of the circuits. And the work is also a machine that generates its own light. So it kind of has this homeostatic functions in response to its own output. It doesn't adapt only to the environment, but also to its internal changes in states. And the work behaves in various ways in relation to viewers. At some point in time, it would go towards them. At other points, it would completely avoid them. So it was characterized by great unpredictability in terms of reading some of its responses. On the right, you can see Orbits, another work which is part of the Vermont collection, which I find really beautiful, since it shows, these two balls that are rotating along this disk, and each of them follows its own trajectory. And the trajectories are kind of concentric, and these objects never meet each other. It's only their reflections that bounce off the spherical surfaces of these balls, right? But it speaks to the connections that are established at a distance, right? Even between people or between cosmic bodies in the absence of direct touch. In this slide, you can also see an image of the plants, the robotic ones I was mentioning earlier, that transform in relation to the environment, just as natural ones do. And in this particular case, they were programmed to respond to light. And they exhibit different types of behavior. As you can see, there's a taller one that has more of a square structure, and there's a shorter one that is kind of domed. And each of them exhibited different patterns and rhythms of light. And according to critics, they spoke about them in terms of different personalities. And I find that Seawright's houseplants foreshadow the Telegarden, the well-known work of Ken Goldberg, in which actual plants can be planted and watered by this robotic farm, which can be actually operated from a distance by participants in the project. So both works kind of speak to this interrelationships between plants, humans, their environment, and also technology. I also wanted to bring into discussion this work that I first came across on when studying about this Magic Theater exhibition, which took place in Kansas City at the Nelson-Atkins since 1968. And several works were commissioned, and they were all art and technology projects, and they wouldn't have come into being unless funding had been made available specifically for this exhibition. And electronic peristyle is composed out of this central unit. You can see over there in the slide is there's this transparent spherical object, and it's surrounded by 12 columns. And the title peristyle kind of points to ancient Greece and the structure of the temple. So this is an electronic temple. And it really calls for viewers to interact with it in order to change the variables of this cybernetic structure. What happens is that from the central unit, which was actually compared to a brain by art critics in responses to the exhibition, there are a series of light beams that project towards the 12 columns made out of formica surrounding it. And participants would be able to move within the space. As you can see, the perimeter of it is slightly raised. They are almost as if on a stage set. And through their movements, they are breaking these light beams, and they are activating and transforming sounds within this environment, also contributing to changes in light and in air currents. And the work really called for engagement over an extended duration in order to kind of tell how the body would be able to modulate this sounds. And James Wright argued that he wanted to create this conceptual understanding of the way technology can be used to exert control over the physical world. And I find peristyle to be this great precursor of more complex interactive scenarios in which the movements of art participants orchestrate sounds. It really anticipates David Rockaby's very nervous system in which one plays a sort of invisible instrument through the movement of the arms and the legs. And this particular work is based on a video tracking system that manages to capture the images and then to convert them into sounds of various pitches. And I think, this work, as well as that of James C. Wright, came across, sort of puzzling challenges when it comes to the number of participants who could interact with them simultaneously. And C. Wright realized that in the case of electronic peripheral, he could only have one or two persons at the time interacting with the work in such a way that there would be this kind of legible relationship. They could really tell how they could influence the sound. If there were too many participants, it would be rendered impossible. And James C. Wright said that it's as if the more elaborate and complicated a system is, the less room there is in that system for the irrationality of human interactions. And he compared this to a metaphor of modern life. And I really find this reflections beautiful. And I think, Rockaby kind of dealt with similar difficulties, even though it's a work of art that accommodates the participation of slightly larger number of people trying to orchestrate the sound through their movements. Despite being based on less advanced technology, C. Wright's mirror-based works from the 1980s allowed him to create more complex behavioral scenarios, their screens reflecting back the presence of multiple concomitant viewers whose images are seemingly suspended in a sort of different time-space direction and dimension. And the mirror pieces really enabled him to expand the field of intuitive interactions with the output that is produced in relation to a person's presence or movement in relation to the artwork. While in the cybernetic sculptures, he had to reduce the number of parameters of interactions at certain points to invite meaningful engagement. The mirror pieces allowed him to encompass and fragment a lot of information, which could be transformed by viewers. And on the left, you can see a public artwork, which is part of the Boston Logan International Airport. It's composed of 721 reflective units, and each of them is placed at a slightly different angle, so that you get this kind of incongruities between this repetitive images of the environment and of the travelers that are moving in relation to this screen of mirrors. And on the right, you can see some of these mirror pieces that were placed in commercial venues. And as I'm sure some of you know, Berman was a key player in terms of the foundation of several malls within America. And he really wanted to show art in relation to these venues. He was really keen on the accessibility of the artworks that he collected, and he insisted on placing this public artworks in conjunction with the malls he administered. And on the one hand, there was a commercial interest, right? With rendering the spaces more distinctive. He also kind of hoped that the longevity of these malls was going to be a lot greater because they became more iconic in quality and people connected to them differently as a result of the artworks. He also thought that by placing these variable artworks within these malls, he didn't really need to rotate exhibits because the works themselves would transform constantly, right? And a person would kind of have different views upon them depending on the time of day, on the moment that he visited the site. So I'm going to talk a bit more closely about some works that are part of this series of mirror pieces. On the left, you can see Mirror 1 that James C. Wright created in 1984 and is part of the Wentworth Atheneum Museum of Art. It's a single focus mirror, meaning that all the components of it, all the reflective units, are facing a point which is situated 8 feet in front of the object. And as you can see, the mirror really encompasses a lot of redundant information, yet viewers kind of feel compelled to organize this information into new structures they are dealing with creating new patterns through the way they interact with the reflective medium. And it's a very different type from our usual interaction with mirrors, right? It's a kind of intuitive process in which one is kind of surprised by the kind of variability that can be introduced within just this set of mirror images. Show you another example, the mirror pieces, which is part of the collection of the Honolulu Museum of Art. The work was undergoing conservation. They were fundraising for restoring it at the time of the pandemic. It's one of the most beloved works out of their collection, as far as I could tell, and it was displayed for a really long time in the foyer of the museum. Here, you can see a similar sort of engagement with this square composed out of mirrors that are set at different angles, and the images are kind of fractured, right? And they appear both distant and proximate, both abstract and figurative. And depending on one's position in relation to it, they can appear quasi-pictorial, or they can be quite cinematic in character. So viewers can create their own compositions, right? And I think you can clearly tell this based on the image on the right. The relations between figure and ground are substituted in this case by that between the viewer and the reflective object. And one is kind of compelled to alter the distance from the mirror surface and rearrange this visual pattern. And this is a work which is part of the Permanence collection. It's called Mirror 17. It's 12 feet by 12 feet. It's made up of 144 mirrors. And the closer one stands to this reflective interface, the more one's image is replicated. And I think the work reveals the way in which reality is a perceptual construction. The same location, the same point in space appears to be experienced in multiple dimensions as one encounters this mirror interface. And it's a kind of work that kind of juggles with your senses, with your sense of motion in space, with encounter with your self-image. It really dislodges that sense of certainty. And it also kind of points to the plasticity of selfhood and to the way in which one is observed by others in multiple ways, right? All these different angles kind of point to all kinds of vantage points that other people might have upon us. So I'm going to show you a short clip so that you get a better sense of how one can interact with this. I find it really interesting how it's a kind of object that reconciles the sameness of this rhythm, right, with the plurality of visual differences that we observe. And it also keeps the viewer on this sort of threshold between narcissistic and voyeuristic impulses, something that many mirror-based works do, especially the ones that have this kind of public dimension to them, and allow for this myriad of reflections to become part of their field. So I also wanted to pair his works with some other ones that are not necessarily based on mirrors, but involve this similar degree of construction based on seriality and the permutation of patterns. As I was mentioning earlier, I find the mirror pieces to be highly cinematic in quality, and they make me think of the long duration of some of the films that were created by Andy Warhol, and they also recall his silkscreen prints, right, which are based on the repetition of the same image, but with a different degree of perfection in terms of the transfer of the original photograph on which they are based. And as I was mentioning, I think, it's a kind of work that is a sculpture, right? Especially with the angles, but it's also connected to pictorial space, and it's also connected to time-based media through this kind of constant flow of reflections that fluctuate across the surface of the mirror screen. It's also the kind of work that kind of oscillates between abstraction and figuration, and it made me think of Soldo Wheat's series of open cubes, and the way he's just using the axes of a cube, parts of a cube, in order to enable the viewer to envision the wholeness of this shape. Compare his works with a couple more images. I couldn't help but connect it to Lucas Samaras's use of mirrors, which comes up much earlier in the 1960s. Samaras created this mesmerizing reflective spaces viewers could enter, and he really emphasized the playful engagement of the viewer with these mirror images in order to gain a sense of orientation within space. And for Samaras, the use of mirrors was a sort of surrogate for social relations that he felt were missing in his own life. He used to state that one cannot live without other people or without mirrors. And he also perceived this kind of engagement with his works as an ephemeral process of painting with one's body upon entering this mirror spaces. He would compare someone's movement in relation to the spaces to scribbles, right? But this kind of scribbles that will disappear upon the point at which one exits the mirror space. On the left, you can see a work by Charles Eldred. He's a Kansas City-based artist. He was a Kansas City-based artist, and I really think, he created fascinating works involving phenomenal experiments with light. His work calls for a lot more scholarly attention, just as James Seawright's work does too. And this is a close-up of one of his screens, which is composed of these rectangular iridescent plates which reflect back light and create this atmospheric effect. And they mirror the shifting attributes of the surroundings. They're not so much focused on someone's image and the way it's encompassed within it. Seawright's mirror pieces also foreshadow a series of responsive artworks based on video technology, which also employ the grid as a way of structuring visual information. This is Deep Walls by Scott Snibbe. It's a responsive work which introduces the images of viewers' shadow play into a circuit of visual information, which includes recordings of prior modes of engaging with the work. Of course, Daniel Rosen created his wooden mirrors in the 1990s. This is one of the first examples of his interactive mirrors. And you have a hexagonal object which is composed out of hundreds of wooden pieces, which are rotating at different angles upon the moment someone approaches the screen of the object. There's a camera which is placed right above it, which captures the images, and then these are kind of transferred through a system of light projection and shadow to create this sort of pixelated portrait of the person facing the work. And of course, there's also the mirror works of Anish Kapoor, which are based on these stainless steel structures. He constructed them in the 2000s, and they have these concave surfaces and distort the images or reverse them, as you can see in this work from 2011. I also wanted to create some connections with some other works in the Berman collection, and particularly with the works of Tullio Alviani, who shares with Seawright the same focus on revealing the process in which the work was created and avoiding mystification. And just as Seawright, he was keen on changes in material properties and in the playful way in which one comes to observe their transformation, kind of independently of the artist's intent. He was really keen on the democratic quality of art. And Getulio Alviani was born in Udine in Italy in 1939. He's well known for his optical artworks as well as for his works of design and architecture. And he was affiliated with the Nouvelle Tendance movement and showed his works in Ljubljana in 1961. They were discovered, these particular verbotile structures were first found by a curator from Ljubljana in a carpentry workshop, and he then asked Alviani to enhance the scale of them. I'm going to play a clip just to give you a sense of how one might engage with them. So they're made of aluminum and on wood panel, and they are absorbing and reflecting back light as one encounters them. And he often works with modules, which he rearranges in various crisscross patterns, as you can see over here. And the object acquires greater or lesser volume, depending on the angle at which it is seen, and also the angle of incidence of light projection across its surface. What Alviani did was to mill the aluminum surface using these abrasive circular discs, and then he would polish them very well so that he obtains this almost blinding effect of light hitting the surface of this aluminum panels. Here are some of his other works, which are based on the use of the same materials. He also created this beautiful environments in which one could engage with one's reflections and the deformations of them in cylindrical shapes. And he was really keen on the objectivity of the phenomena. And he was anti-elitist and thought, like every person would be able to experience this work and kind of break apart, the way this phenomenon happens of light reflection through the interaction with the mirror and the variables, the aluminum panels. And last but not least, I'd like to mention the work of Julio Leparc, who was in conversation actually with Getulio Alviani. And they were both connected to the group de recherche d'art visuel activities, this group in Paris. Julio Leparc trained as a painter in Argentina, and he moved to Paris in 1958. Initially, he was working on this grid-based composition with chromatic permutations, which elicited this kind of sense of virtual motion when being encountered. But towards the mid-60s, he kind of shifts towards the use of reflective materials such as glass, metal, and plexiglass. And here we can see one of his continual Lumiere mobiles. And there are all these metallic elements, these discs that are hanging from nylon, these very thin threads, and they're hovering in the air and reflecting light, projecting it also, and giving vent to this kind of atmospheric effect. And his works are also part of the Berman collection. He had a retrospective at the Howard Weiss Gallery in the 1960s in US. And I'm gonna play a clip so that you get a better sense of the movement of the work. And his works are really poetic, and they invite reflection on light phenomena, but they are also kind of correlated with the whole social theory. he really felt that in urban societies, we are so much more exposed to lots of stimuli, right? That demand our attention, and that reality becomes increasingly unstable. And I think the work speak to that to a certain extent, but they also solicit our attention in other ways, right? They seek to emancipate the viewer and making him or her more aware, right, of the variability of perception and the way we ourselves participate in the shaping of what we perceive. And here's another work of his. This is a ceiling light sculpture. It has a much larger number of components, and it's much more complex in terms of the visual effects it creates and the correlations that exist between this stainless steel, very thin plates and their projections and shadows and reflections. I find the work really beautiful in terms of the continuity of the light and the discontinuity of the effects that are being produced and the way it destabilizes our senses as we encounter it. There's this kind of vibratile motion of the various pieces that move in various directions simultaneously. So what I find that all these three phenomenal artworks in the Berman collection are signaling is this interdependence between physical phenomena and the environment, as well as the constructive nature of our perception. They all propose structures with variable appearances, emphasizing process over object, variability over stasis, contingency over autonomy, and they destabilize human-centered perception too, and invite one to account for ongoing changes that may be more or less noticeable. These reflective works also elicit playful engagement. They really speak to changes in modes of art reception that happened from the 1960s onwards. And they demand our attention in a way that is somewhat different from other art objects, in the sense that they ask viewers to test out different possibilities, to juggle with the variables over which they may have more or less control, and also grasp the limitations that exist in terms of their agency and what they can achieve through the interaction with the object. All three of them, in very different ways, invite us to respond to repetitive and mutable visual information, and in the process, envision feedback circuits which are otherwise overlooked. And I will also argue in my conclusion that they cultivate a certain humbleness, since the presence of the viewer is this ethereal trace in this field of floating reflection. So I'm going to stop here. I think, this should give you a sense of multiple correlations between these various works and their phenomenal attributes. And I'm going to invite the respondents to enter into conversation now. And I'm really grateful for their presence, Min and Ellen, for being willing to contribute, and David Familian and Jim for joining the conversation too.
Oh, that was such a wonderful talk. Yes, yes.
I have a few comments. First of all, thank you so much, Cristina, for this comprehensive view of these people's works. There were parts I was totally unfamiliar with, and I found it really fascinating. I also found it very surprising. One of the comments you made at the onset was to remark that there was a difference of objectivity versus subjectivity on the part of the work that was produced. And the reason for it was that the artist hoped to avoid elitism. And I found that interesting, particularly since having recently returned from Documenta, where there was a great effort to give people a degree of agency and refute the kind of, and challenge the elitism. But the way it was produced didn't come off the same with the same kind of equation of objectivity to subjectivity. And that could be a question, but I have some others I'd like to bring up. It occurred to me listening to you to wonder when sentience became a real concern in this kind of art. Now, the book that you co-edited with Dawna Schuld, part of it was about agency. I was honored to have a chapter included on my take on attention. But I do find agency, again, subject not only to a historical kind of conditioning, but what we expect of it today. So I'd be interested in your thoughts of whether the two artists that you discussed ever considered sentience or wrote about it with respect to the viewer and to agency and their agency. And was this also tied to their works being located in physical space? To give people an example of what I'm talking about, I had sent you an image of the work of Justine Emard, if you could bring that up.
Sure,
Cristina.
I have your slide. Let me see if I can get to that.
Yeah, superorganism. This is also a light installation by Justine Emard, which consists of robotic glass sculptures brought to life by means of neural networks trained on the behavior of bees. So all of a sudden, what you're seeing is that agency is given between species and not restricted to humans or to spectators responding to those conditions. So she implemented machine learning in collaboration with an AI developer. And here she uses AI algorithms, biomedia, and basically is collaborating to explore possibilities of creative cohabitation with the possibility of different species. Now, I was not aware, I don't know the answer, whether the work can be altered or moderated by the presence of a viewer. The spherical light object that you see creates sequences of light that appear to change, but I'm not clear that it's interactive. There is an audio component produced by filaments in the bulb that touch the surface. And it also struck me, again, with the wood mirror piece, that the audio component comes from the material out of which it is built, rather than something added to that. Let me just see if there's any other. So I guess I would also say of the various kinds of approaches, you can see if you go down one, that I included Kurt Henschlager's Z, which took on really beautiful shifting formations and interactive, overwhelming light sculpture to experience in an immersive dark room. Just go down a little more and look at some of the others. This has different issues expressed with regard to mirrors. And here there is in a way the opposite of agency, because there is no way a spectator can cause fusion. Next, please. And this diagram showed how Smithson constructed it and what his concerns were. And I think there's another one yet. You already showed the Roseanne. Okay, so that pretty much is my take on it. And thanks again for your talk. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about agency, what constitutes agency in this kind of work.
Thank you so much for wonderful comments. They're extremely insightful, and for expanding the sphere of analogous with Wright's work. Based on my current readings of Albiani's statements and also Julio Lepar's statements, I haven't found any specific reference to sentience, but it does come up as a correlation with Wright in the sense that he's comparing at one point these machines, right? He's saying that they are almost like sentient beings, right? And he's really keen on homeostasis. He's really keen on creating cybernetic sculptures that respond not only to the viewer or to multiple viewers, but also to their own changes, to their own transformation in processes. And I think, like in this sense, he's really trying to move us beyond this notion that agency can be defined only in relation to human beings. And the very fact that he's not keen on talking about the relationship between the human subject and the work, even though that's part of his practice, right? He's not completely suppressing that. Many of his works really oscillate that transform in relation to the presence of the viewers, but very often they have two cycles of operation. They can operate on their own perfectly well, so that the human is not this kind of trigger of the variability of the object. So they have two cycles. If an electronic carousel, it had its own program of sounds that would transform over the course of the time, and it had a memory unit. So it would accumulate knowledge over the course of time based on the way it would transform. And then, it could also be altered by human beings, but it was never, this kind of intention that the human being is going to be the sole trigger of transformation. So that's why his kind of system-oriented perspective upon art making. I don't see that being as much part of the thinking of Albiani and Julio Lepar. I think, like they are very different artists to start with, but I think they are very interesting correspondences in terms of their thinking about attention and about visual information and the redundancy of it and the way we organize it in patterns. And I think this element of, destabilizing perception, which I think, like it's something that comes up, in all the works that you showed us in this slide, is also crucial for all the three artists involved. I think, like agency, I think we shouldn't define it just in terms of control, right? And I think, like all these works are showing the limits of controllability, right? I think, we really need to cultivate this more humble attitude towards, our existence in space and in time, and think about this relationship with multiple others. As for interspecies communication, I don't see that being as much part of this works. But I think, it's an increasing concern for lots of artists nowadays. Thomas Saraceno as well, and his amazing work with spider webs and with vibrations, once again, that cannot be sensed by human beings through the usual senses, right?
Cristina, I have a question or a comment, I guess.
Sure.
Unfortunately, my internet went out for part of your thing, but I want to comment on Jim Seawright's work, since I was teaching at Princeton one of the semesters when he was there. So, and sort of piggyback on what Ellen was, the elitism that Ellen brought up, because just him as an artist, I think he was an extremely generous person and artist, and wanted people to know he didn't hide anything about what he was doing or why he was doing it. He was very democratic and very humble in that sense. And he would share a piece he was working on with students who were trying to do something in his Sculpture 101 class, the exact same mechanics, the tinkering. He loved getting in there with his hands. So I just wanted to comment on that as a major part of his personality, which I think it really shows in the work. And the second thing was he had a quote in very large letters above his office door. And it said, "Any physical object that exists in the world takes time to see." And he constantly talked about the difference between looking and seeing. And I think that was a very important part of making the work and how we wanted people approaching the work to experience it and to see it. And to that effect, although he did the kind of work he did, his assignment to sculpture students was to take a big chunk of clay and make a likeness of someone else. And for someone who's never attempted sculpture before and might be a physics major or something at Princeton, that's no easy task. But it was his way of banging that home that it's seeing that's important. So I just feel watching, hearing you talk about his work and seeing the work again, that was such an important part of his being as an artist, though, that particular thing about seeing.
Thank you for sharing that. It's so beautiful and deep, actually, as a philosophy in many ways.
I had no idea you had actually been at Princeton at the same time with James C. Wright, and
very beautiful
connection, right?
So Jim
would have appreciated.
Jim has a question for you.
Yeah.
A very nice talk. Enjoyed it. So my question is, you know, I know about this artist C. Wright, you know, and I've listened to him speak, you know, on the YouTube and so on. Anyway, he, to me, is he graduated with study in physics, okay, and then he had no artistic training, and then he liked to monkey around in a machine shop. And he also liked soldering. So he put those two things together and generated this art, right? And he ended up as a professor of art, but he wasn't an artist in the classical sense. So if you take all these artists that are using the technology, you know, whether it be the mechanical or electronic, they all must come from different backgrounds. So the work of C. Wright he creates it because he's good at working in a machine shop with solder. So how does the background of these artists that are involved, how does it it influences their work? How does it influence it? So for instance, someone with more classical art training, how does that compare with C. Wright, who seems to be like a kind of grease monkey, you know?
You know, that's fascinating, you know, like, and the more I learn about, you know, art and technology projects and the way they came into being in the 60s, the more struck I am by this kind of differences in terms of the training of the artists and the way in which they envision the art objects. But I think, you know, like, irrespective of their training, whether, you know, it started in technology or in art, I think, you know, like, most of them created this kind of responsive artworks, started to embrace this kind of system perspective, system thinking about the artwork, where it's no longer an object that is insular, that comes to be discovered by this one individual viewer, but it's part of a multitude, right? And I think, you know, there are different ways, you know, there's lots of artists who had to be paired with engineers in order to create their works collaboratively. But I think in all of those practices, there's this element of intuition and display. And James C. Wright would often, you know, like, he would buy, you know, commercially available devices and then tinker with them and figure out what if we do this thing versus this thing, what if we alter this parameter versus the other, and what if we open up the possibility for others to join in modifying the artwork and making it more mutable. Yeah, Ellen.
Yeah, as you're speaking, and in response to Jim's comment, too, I'd like to remind people that when Watson and Crick made their first model for DNA, they basically used wood or clay to do this, just things they got from the local hardware store, because their usual modeling tools were not available to them at that time, and they were in a hurry. So here's another point of commonality with the artists and scientists.
And also with music composers, I found this text by James C. Wright on, like what are the basics in terms of music studio. There's an article that he writes, what would be the equipment that would be needed in it. And I think it was, like maybe it was an article from the late 60s or 70s that I came across. So they're also, I think, like for someone working with technology and not coming from a training that is lodged in visual arts, there's this kind of greater degree of flexibility of thinking across media and thinking about this kind of ongoing processes, time-based quality of the materials, the devices that they're using. I think that's part of that kind of openness that they might have by surpassing this more traditional pathway into the arts. And I think getting back to what Neem was saying earlier about, this quote, it kind of stays on my mind. And physical objects that exist in the world and the time they take to be seen. And this aspect of duration, the fact that even, in our encounter with machines and even trying to break down our interaction with them, the kind of feedback that is produced through our input, even in that case, there's this kind of need for an extended duration, right? And I think there's another way in which we think about humanity in relation to computers. All these different types of technologies really solicited all this questioning of our own views.
They're all subject to entropy, and so because of, that spatial temporal evolution of things, self-organization. And then you mentioned that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties in, but with those mirroring processes, and also with Robert Smithson's approach of that concept, since Ellen brought up the enantiomorphic chambers in which you're looking through the devices, but you cannot reconcile the two views as you normally do through your vision. So I think entropy is another great concept through which we could look at the works of James C. Wright. I haven't encountered any mentioning of it, but I think it would be really important in relation to the thinking about his mirror pieces and the fragmentation of information that appears in them.
I think there's a question from Nina Subel just thanking you actually for the great talk. I'm wondering if David has something to chime in. Or Nina.
I was just in response to this idea of training. I think it's interesting that now artists being trained in technology by artists who were trained in technology, that most artists of my generation, or a number of us here, learn technology after learning another medium, coming from another medium. And so it's sort of interesting how this is going to change what Jim was sort of saying, where these artists started to when people are beginning to be trained over and the pedagogy gets more established. Whether that'll be good or bad, I don't know. But because it has good and bad, but I just think we'll see major changes. I think all the work in a lot of the work in technology is in the spirit of the works you showed. And it doesn't seem to, it seems to continue no matter what the training of the artist is, of indeterminacy, time-based, some sort of responsive, all that seems to be a kernel that we're saving also from art of the 60s and 70s, whether it's technology or Fluxus or other experimental kinds of work, that's where it sort of is living. That is in the work with technology.
Right.
And thank you for your talk.
Thank you, David. And I think a lot of the work will be a lot more collaborative. It needs to be so from scratch, I think, for transdisciplinary inquiries to really develop. It cannot happen along the way. And those were some of the limitations of many of the works from the 60s and 70s, because the initial idea was, well, the artists will come up with the concept, and then the engineers are going to provide the solution to the problem that is raised by the artist. But I think increasingly, we are moving away from that model, which actually fails very often, precisely because some of the engineers were not fully engaged in the conceptual process.
Yeah, LACMA is a perfect example.
Exactly. Right, for sure. The Art and Technology Project there by Morris.
There's a question from an online audience. Christiane Filippone, thanks you for your excellent presentation. And she's asking if Alviani seeked physical participation of viewers with the work of like some other nouvelle technoetic artists.
Yeah, he was very much part of the group of nouvelle tendance artists. He showed together with them, and Cristina Filippone has written an amazing text on utopia, women artists, and science and technology from the 1960s, 1970s onwards. And yeah, I think that's totally the case. He was very much interested in the physicality of the encounter with his vibratile structures, and also in the mutability of the material properties of the work. She also wrote a lot on the practices of nouvelle tendance artists more generally, and was very interested in this idea of play and bringing in elements from science into art. And as I was saying, like really moving past this idea that art is solely about the subjectivity of the individual artist or the viewer. And I don't want to create this kind of binary between the subjective and the objective. I'm sorry if that might have come out that way in my presentation on the concept of phenomenal art, but there are different degrees of emphasis. I don't think we can set them up in this kind of dichotomic way. I think to a certain extent, subjectivity comes into play also in the experience of many of the works of nouvelle tendance artists, even though theoretical in terms of their premise for the art creation, they wanted to suppress that. But I think it also had a lot to do with this kind of focus on subjectivity and the genius artists, right? Like Pollock, and they were very much resisting art informel as well in Europe. So I think that the sort of response, a rejection of that, had a lot to do with that positioning in relation to existing styles.
Sounds like a really important piece to read, so we'll look into that and link it for everybody. And I should mention that maybe you are aware that Alviani was actually the very first artist that David Bermant acquired for his collection.
I forgot to mention that. I felt like I was rushing at some point. But yeah, he paid $1,000 for it in Rome, and apparently, like his family members were more keen on acquiring the work than he was, and it was just a souvenir. And I was reading in one of the catalogs that he was stunned when he came back to New York and realized that MoMA had acquired an Alviani piece. And I think at that point he reconsidered the value and the relevance of it. So it's a great starting point for an amazing collection.
And he truly collected because of the interest in connecting art and science, and not as a kind of a way to become part of the market or think of the value. In fact, a lot of the works had no value at that point. And I think that's what makes it so wonderful, that it was about the relationships with the artist, not so much about the buying the art. And you actually mentioned an important point, that dialogue was very much alive even with Seawright, right? When he commissioned works.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, like, he seems so well connected for someone who's, like, he's an outsider initially to the art world entirely. He establishes this relationship with Ivan Karp and with Howard Weiss, right? And with all these people who really believed in these new tendencies in art. And
Yeah.
also so many artists were underappreciated who really, like weren't able to sell their artwork at all. And he was able to fund them and to commission works, not only to purchase existing works, but this kind of, like vision that he had to make those funds available for works that wouldn't have come into being really, right? Unless the funding was there.
And the house plant was in his garden. It was literally in his garden, which is one of the reasons that it's not working very well.
Yeah, I think it calls for a lot of investment in the preservation of many of these works, which are so important. They are such a keynote in terms of development in arts and technology and the system-oriented perspective on art making.
Well, it was a wonderful talk. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, Cristina, thank you. You touched on 3 of my favorites, and David loved anything that encouraged fun and play, and the mirror piece definitely does that. And I see, as Victoria said, I have one in my home, and my daughters and her friends are just drawn to that piece, and they love to position themselves so they can see themselves 144 times and then practice their, TikTok dances and whatever else. So it is really fun. It is really fun. It brings a lot of joy. It brings a lot of joy. Yeah.
Once again, we're about identity.
If David could only see, he would love it.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Beth. Appreciate that. Yes. And I think, it's fun play and it's serious play at the same time. That's the beauty of the work, that it can, pose all these questions and it can trigger these performative impulses. So at the same time, we can consider that flux in images also from these other perspectives that have to do with perception and our relationship to the broader world.
So, Cristina, one last question. Did you start researching mirror and perception that led you to looking at cognitive science and neuroscience in art?
Yeah. This was the path. So I think, my first book focused on this mirroring processes in art from 1960s to the present. And when writing it, I was not aware of Jim C. Wright's mirror works from the 80s. I talked about his electronic peristyle in that book, and mirroring not only in terms of the reflective images, but also in terms of this feedback that exists in information circuits that are developed around artworks. And I think, at one point while presenting my work at conferences, someone brought up the concept of mirror neurons, and I had no idea what they were at that point in time, and how, this kind of public dimension of spectatorship and this kind of awareness that we have of each other in relation to this mirror interfaces activates the mirror neurons. And I think that was a link. I think that was the moment at which, this new project started to come into being, the one that has to do with neurofeedback. But I think many of these works on mirror processes really call into question, how the mind works, how we organize information, how if we have too much information, we start hallucinating, start seeing things that are not there. And this is the way in which we become aware of the fact that reality is just a construct. And it's not just a social construct, but it's also a construct that results from biology of seeing, of human seeing, and the limitations of it. I think it really renders us aware of all these other issues that have to do with the relationship between emotion, perception, and cognition. So this was a move in that direction for sure. I think that the mirror was part of it from the very beginning.
That's so interesting to me, because I've interacted with you on that level, looking at neuroscience and the mirror coming from that area. So to kind of go back to your source is beautiful too. And I remember at school, I used to play a lot with mirrors. Like that was what I was doing in my grad school, was crashing mirrors, putting them back together. And so much of it is unconscious, actually. So you brought up a lot of issues around identity and mirroring and reality and what's happening.
And it all goes back to my childhood.
Always.
I had this
Always.
tripartite mirror.
Really?
In my apartment. I never realized it. Like I wrote this book, and then it just struck me at one point. I have photographs of myself, and you could kind of move. It was a hinge mirror, so you could move these other components, and you could see your myriad reflection in it. And I kind of played around with it a lot as a kid, but it was kind of stunning that that connection did not occur to me at all until the project was complete.
Amazing. How much happens in the subconscious that we're not aware of. It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Unless there's any final comments from our respondents, we will close with these beautiful thoughts about mindful thinking of our reflections, our reality, and art and science coming together in the mirror.
Thanks so much, Victoria.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Ellen, Nini, Jim, and David. It was wonderful to have you. And Bess, thank you for supporting this as always.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.